They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what happens when that love becomes a one-way street paved with exploitation and entitlement? What happens when the person you've sacrificed everything for treats you like a disposable convenience the moment you need them most? I'm Vivian Ross, and I'm about to tell you a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about family loyalty and the true cost of unconditional giving. Picture this. You're 68 years old, standing alone in the middle of a bustling international airport terminal, watching your only daughter drive away without a backward glance because helping you would interfere with her vacation plans. The suitcase at your feet contains everything you packed for what was supposed to be a simple medical trip, and the silence around you is deafening, despite the chaos of travelers rushing past. But here's the thing about being abandoned by the person you love most. Sometimes it's exactly the wake-up call you need to realize that unconditional love shouldn't mean unconditional enabling. This is the story of how my daughter's selfishness became her most expensive mistake, and how my response taught her the true value of what she'd thrown. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we dive into this story, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if what you're about to hear resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something truly extraordinary lined up for you. There's an old saying that blood is thicker than water, but I've learned that sometimes blood can run ice cold when convenience is more important than compassion. For 68 years, I believed that being a good mother meant putting your daughter's needs before your own. That love meant always saying yes, always being available, always sacrificing without question. I believed that if you gave enough, loved enough, and sacrificed enough, you would be valued and cherished in return. I was wrong. My name is Vivian Ross, and I'm about to tell you a story that shattered everything I thought I knew about motherhood, family, loyalty, and the dangerous difference between loving someone and enabling them. This is the story of how a routine medical appointment became the day I discovered my daughter's true character, and how my response to her betrayal became the most important lesson I ever taught her about consequences and respect. For decades, I had built my entire identity around being the perfect mother. I was the woman who never said no, never complained, and never asked for anything in return. When my daughter Eliza needed college tuition, I refinanced my house. When she wanted to start her interior design business, I provided the startup capital. When she decided to buy a house in the expensive Willowbrook Hills neighborhood, I co-signed the mortgage and provided the down payment. When her husband, Alfie's landscaping company, struggled during the recession, I kept them afloat with monthly loans that were never repaid. I told myself I was investing in my daughter's happiness and success. I convinced myself that her achievements were my achievements, that her gratitude was implied rather than expressed, and that asking for anything in return would somehow diminish the purity of a mother's love. I had trained myself to find fulfillment in giving, even when that giving had become a pattern of taking that left me emotionally and financially drained. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves when you're forced to step outside your comfortable delusions and see them clearly. And sometimes, it takes a moment of absolute abandonment to understand that you've been enabling someone's worst impulses instead of nurturing their best qualities. The wake-up call came on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning in September. I had been experiencing some concerning symptoms that my doctor wanted to investigate further at the Pinnacle Medical Center in Denver, about 4 hours from my home in Crescent Valley. The appointment was scheduled for early morning, which meant an overnight stay and a very early departure from the regional airport. At 68, I was still perfectly capable of traveling alone, but the medical procedures were going to involve sedation, which meant I would need someone to accompany me and ensure I got home safely. The doctor had been very clear about this requirement. No exceptions, no alternatives. It wasn't just hospital policy, it was a safety necessity. When I called Eliza to explain the situation, Her response should have been my first clue about what was coming. Instead of immediate concern about my health or offers to help, her first question was about the timing. "This Tuesday? Mom, that's really inconvenient. Alfie and I have been planning our anniversary getaway to Aspen for months. We're supposed to leave Tuesday afternoon." I felt that familiar twist in my stomach that came whenever my needs conflicted with Eliza's plans, but I pushed it aside as I always did. "I understand it's short notice, honey, but the doctor says it can't wait. The appointment took months to schedule, and if we postpone it, who knows when we'll get another slot." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear her discussing something with Alfie in muffled tones. When she came back, her voice had that carefully controlled tone I had learned to recognize over the years. The tone that meant she was about to explain why her priorities took precedence over mine. "Mom, here's what we can do. I can drive you to the airport Tuesday morning, and then you can take care of the medical stuff yourself. You're perfectly capable of handling a simple doctor's appointment. Then when you fly back Wednesday evening, you can just take a taxi home. That way, Alfie and I can still make our afternoon flight to Aspen." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow, but not because it was unreasonable, because it was so perfectly characteristic of how Eliza had learned to navigate any situation that required sacrifice on her part. She had become a master at finding solutions that required minimal inconvenience to her, while placing the burden of accommodation squarely on my shoulders. "Eliza," I said carefully, "the doctor specifically said I need someone with me because of the sedation. I won't be able to drive or make decisions for several hours after the procedure. It's not optional." "Mom, you're being dramatic. It's just some medical tests, right? How complicated can it be? You managed to raise me as a single mother. You can certainly handle a doctor's appointment on your own." The casual dismissal of my medical needs, combined with the guilt-inducing reference to my past sacrifices, was so typical of our dynamic that I almost accepted it without further protest. For years, I had trained myself to minimize my own needs whenever they conflicted with Eliza's convenience. I had become an expert at finding ways to accommodate her schedule, her priorities, and her comfort level, even when doing so required significant sacrifice on my part. But something about this situation felt different. Maybe it was the stark medical necessity that couldn't be negotiated away, or maybe it was the casual way she had dismissed something that was genuinely frightening for me. At 68, facing medical procedures alone in an unfamiliar city wasn't just inconvenient, it was genuinely scary. "Eliza, I'm asking you to postpone your trip by one day. Just one day. I've never asked you to choose between me and your plans before, but this time I really need you." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted to a tone I had heard many times before, the tone of someone who had already made their decision and was now working to make me feel guilty for questioning it. "Mom, you know how hard Alfie has been working lately. This trip is really important for our relationship. We've paid for everything already, and the hotel has a strict cancellation policy. I'm sorry, but we just can't change our plans now. You'll be fine. You always are." And there it was. The complete dismissal of my needs wrapped in false concern and financial excuses from a woman whose lifestyle I had been subsidizing for over a decade. The woman who lived in a house I had helped her buy, whose business I had funded, whose husband's company I had kept afloat, was telling me that a hotel cancellation fee was more important than ensuring her mother's safety during a medical procedure. That Tuesday morning, as I prepared for what I thought would be a simple drive to the airport, I had no idea that I was about to receive the most painful and illuminating education of my life. I had no idea that my daughter's true character was about to be revealed in a way that would change our relationship forever. I certainly had no idea that by the end of the week, Eliza would be learning some very expensive lessons about the difference between a mother's love and a mother's unlimited tolerance for disrespect. The drive to Crescent Valley Regional Airport that Tuesday morning started like so many others. Over the years, with me accommodating Eliza's schedule while she made it clear that helping me was an inconvenience she was grudgingly accepting. But this wasn't just any ordinary favor I was asking for. This was about my health, potentially, my life, and the fear that had been growing in my chest for weeks since my doctor had first mentioned the concerning test results. The medical situation had begun 3 months earlier during what should have been a routine checkup. Dr. Sarah Chen at Crescent Valley Medical had found some irregularities in my blood work that warranted further investigation. The follow-up tests had led to more questions, and eventually Dr. Chen had referred me to a specialist at Pinnacle Medical Center in Denver, one of the top diagnostic facilities in the region. "Mrs. Ross," Dr. Chen had explained during our consultation, "the symptoms you've been experiencing, combined with these test results, require some very specific imaging and procedures that we simply don't have the equipment for here in Crescent Valley. Dr. Reese Patterson at Pinnacle is one of the best in his field, and I've managed to get you an appointment. But I have to warn you, his schedule is booked months in advance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. The appointment had taken 4 months to arrange. 4 months of wondering, worrying, and trying to maintain a normal facade while dealing with symptoms that seemed to be getting progressively worse. The fatigue that I had initially attributed to aging had become overwhelming. The occasional dizziness had turned into episodes that left me gripping furniture for support. The mysterious pain in my abdomen had become a constant companion that kept me awake at night. But more than the physical symptoms, it was the fear that had been eating away at me. At 68, I had already buried my parents and most of my older relatives. I had watched my late husband battle his final illness with courage and dignity, and I knew what serious medical conditions looked like from the family perspective. The careful way Dr. Chen spoke about my case, the urgency behind her referral, and the battery of tests that Dr. Patterson wanted to run all pointed to something potentially serious. I had tried to share these fears with Eliza over the past few months, but she had consistently minimized my concerns. "Mom, you're probably just stressed. You worry too much about everything. I'm sure it's nothing serious. You've always been healthy as a horse." Her dismissive responses had trained me to keep my growing anxiety to myself, but that had only made the fear more overwhelming. The procedures Dr. Patterson had scheduled were comprehensive and invasive. I would need to arrive at the hospital early Tuesday morning for preparation, undergo several hours of imaging and diagnostic tests, then remain for observation as the sedation wore off. The medical center had been very clear that patients undergoing these procedures could not drive, make important decisions, or travel alone for at least 12 hours afterward. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a strict medical requirement with liability implications for both the hospital and the patient. When I had first explained this to Eliza 6 weeks earlier, her response had been typical. "Mom, why didn't you schedule this for a better time? You know, September is our busiest month with the business, and we've had this anniversary trip planned forever." As if I had deliberately chosen to develop concerning medical symptoms at an inconvenient time for her schedule. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to Eliza's self-centered responses to my needs, but this felt different. This wasn't about helping me move furniture or watching my house while I was away. This was about potentially life-altering medical issues, and her primary concern seemed to be how my health crisis might affect her vacation plans. The anniversary trip to Aspen had been a source of constant conversation for months. Eliza and Alfie had booked a luxury resort, planned elaborate activities, and purchased new wardrobes for the occasion. The trip represented everything about their lifestyle that had become possible through my financial support. Expensive. Tastes funded by someone else's sacrifices. Their interior design business, Willowbrook Interiors, had been successful largely because they had never needed to worry about basic financial pressures. When cash flow was tight, I provided bridge loans. When they wanted to take on bigger projects that required upfront investments, I covered the costs. When they decided to move their office to a more prestigious location in the arts district, I paid the security deposits and first year's rent. Similarly, Alfie's landscaping company, Alpine Gardens, had survived the recession and thrived afterward primarily because I had kept it afloat during the difficult years. When clients weren't paying on time, I covered payroll. When equipment needed replacing, I provided the capital. When they wanted to expand into high-end commercial projects, I guaranteed the loans that made it possible. In return, I had received the satisfaction of knowing my daughter was successful and comfortable, but I had also created a dynamic where my needs were always secondary to their convenience. They had learned to see my resources as an extension of their own, and my availability as something they could count on without reciprocation. The night before the airport trip, I had called Eliza one more time to confirm the arrangements. I had been hoping that she might have reconsidered her plan to simply drop me off and leave, especially after I had explained the medical requirements in more detail. "Mom, we've been through this," she had said with barely concealed irritation. "I'll pick you up at 6:30 and get you to the airport in plenty of time for your 8 o'clock flight. You'll be fine. You're tougher than you think you are. And honestly, this might be good for you. You've become too dependent on having people do things for you. A little independence will be character building." The irony was breathtaking. The woman whose entire adult lifestyle had been subsidized by my financial support was lecturing me about independence while refusing to provide the one form of support I had ever specifically requested and genuinely needed. That night, I had lain awake staring at the ceiling of my bedroom in the modest ranch house I had lived in for 30 years. The same house I had refinanced multiple times to fund Eliza's dreams and emergencies. The house that would have been paid off years ago if I hadn't used the equity to support my daughter's various ventures and lifestyle choices. I thought about the pattern that had developed over the decades since Eliza had become an adult. Every request for help came with urgency and emotional pressure. Every financial crisis in her life somehow became my responsibility to solve. Every success she achieved was celebrated as a joint accomplishment, but every sacrifice I made was treated as something I should be grateful to provide. But this time felt different because this time I was the one who needed help, and the contrast in our approaches was stark and painful. When Eliza needed something, it was always urgent, always justified, and always something I should want to provide if I truly loved her. When I needed something, it was inconvenient, probably unnecessary, and definitely something I should be able to handle on my own. As I packed my small overnight bag that Monday evening, I found myself wondering when exactly our relationship had become so one-sided. When had I trained my daughter to see my needs as less important than her wants? When had I enabled her to develop the kind of selfishness that could dismiss her mother's medical fears as an inconvenience to her vacation schedule? I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out just how deep that selfishness went, and just how little my years of sacrifice and support had meant when they were weighed against a luxury resort reservation and the potential inconvenience of spending 2 days caring for the person who had spent 35 years caring for her. The alarm was set for 5:30 a.m. Eliza would arrive at 6:30 to drive me to the airport for my 8-hour flight. By this time tomorrow, I would know the results of my medical tests, but I would also know something far more important and far more painful. I would know exactly what my relationship with my daughter was really worth. The morning of my departure began with the kind of small inconsistencies that should have prepared me for what was coming, but I was so accustomed to making excuses for Eliza's behavior that I dismissed each red flag as it appeared. Looking back now, I can see that the warning signs were everywhere. I just wasn't ready to acknowledge what they meant. Eliza arrived 15 minutes late, which wasn't unusual, but her demeanor when she walked through my front door was different from what I had expected. Instead of the concerned daughter I had hoped to see, she appeared distracted and slightly irritated, checking her phone constantly and tapping her foot while I gathered my belongings. "Mom, we really need to get moving," she said before I had even finished locking the front door. "Traffic is going to be terrible, and I have a million things to do before Alfie and I leave for the airport this afternoon." The casual mention of their afternoon departure stung more than I wanted to admit. While I would be alone in a hospital room in Denver, they would be boarding a plane to Aspen for their romantic getaway. The timing could have been adjusted. Their flight wasn't until 4 p.m., which meant they could have easily delayed their departure until Wednesday and still had 5 days in Aspen instead of 6. But apparently, even one day of their vacation was more valuable than ensuring their mother's safety during a medical procedure. As we drove through the early morning streets of Crescent Valley, I tried to engage Eliza in conversation about the medical tests I was facing, hoping that talking through my anxieties might help her understand why I needed her support. Instead, her responses revealed just how little attention she had been paying to my health concerns over the past few months. "So remind me what exactly they're testing for," she asked, not taking her eyes off her phone as she navigated traffic. I had explained this to her multiple times, but I patiently went through it again. Dr. Chen found some abnormalities in my blood work that could indicate several different conditions. Dr. Patterson needs to do specialized imaging and some procedures to rule out the more serious possibilities. Right, Eliza replied, absently, clearly not listening as she typed out a text message. "But you feel fine, right? I mean, you're not actually sick or anything." The question revealed so much about how she had been processing, or rather not processing, the information I had been trying to share with her. The fatigue that had been overwhelming me for months, the dizziness episodes that had become increasingly frequent, the abdominal pain that kept me awake at night. I had mentioned all of these symptoms to her repeatedly, but she had either forgotten or chosen not to retain any of it. "Eliza, I haven't been feeling fine. That's why I need these tests. I've been experiencing symptoms that are concerning enough for Dr. Chen to refer me to a specialist in Denver." "Oh," she said finally, looking up from her phone. "Well, I'm sure it's nothing serious. You've always been a bit of a hypochondriac, Mom. Remember when you thought you were having a heart attack and it turned out to be acid reflux?" The comparison was both inaccurate and hurtful. The incident she was referring to had happened over 10 years ago, and even then, it had been Dr. Chen who had suggested the emergency room visit after I described my symptoms during a routine appointment. But more than the factual errors, what hurt was the implication that my current medical concerns were just another example of unnecessary worry that she didn't need to take seriously. As we got closer to the airport, Eliza's phone rang, and she answered it without hesitation, launching into an animated conversation with someone about floral arrangements for a client's house. For the next 15 minutes, as I sat beside her trying to process my anxiety about the day ahead, she discussed color palettes, delivery schedules, and budget concerns as if I weren't even in the car. When she finally ended the call, I tried one more time to explain why I needed her support. "Eliza, I know this is inconvenient timing, but I'm really scared about today. I've never had to deal with anything like this alone, and being in an unfamiliar hospital in another city makes it even more frightening." Her response was everything I had learned to expect from her over the years, but somehow it felt more jarring in the context of a genuine medical crisis. "Mom, you're going to be fine. You're stronger than you think you are, and honestly, this will probably be good for you. You've gotten too comfortable relying on other people for everything. Learning to handle things independently will build your confidence." The psychological manipulation was so smooth and practiced that it took me a moment to recognize what she was doing. Instead of acknowledging my legitimate need for support during a medical procedure, she was reframing my request as a character flaw that she was actually helping me overcome by refusing to provide assistance. My fear and vulnerability were being redefined as weaknesses that needed to be corrected rather than natural responses to a frightening situation that deserved compassion. But the most telling moment came when we arrived at the airport and I started to get out of the car. Eliza remained in the driver's seat with the engine running, making no move to help me with my luggage or walk me to the terminal. "Aren't you going to park and come in with me?" I asked, confused by her behavior. She looked at me as if I had suggested something unreasonable. "Mom, why would I need to come in? You know how to check in and find your gate. I need to get home and finish packing for our trip." The casual dismissal was stunning. This wasn't a routine business trip or a vacation departure. This was her 68-year-old mother leaving for medical procedures that could potentially reveal life-threatening conditions, and she couldn't spare the 15 minutes it would take to ensure I got checked in safely and offer a proper goodbye. As I pulled my small suitcase from her back seat, I tried one more time to penetrate the wall of self-absorption that seemed to surround her. "Eliza, I might get some scary news today. If something serious is wrong, I'm going to be facing it completely alone in a city where I don't know anyone." She was already looking at her phone again, checking messages that had arrived during our conversation. "Mom, you're being overly dramatic. If something was seriously wrong, Dr. Chen would have told you already. These are just routine tests to rule things out. You'll be fine, and you'll probably feel silly for worrying so much." The certainty in her voice was remarkable, especially considering that she had demonstrated no understanding of my actual medical situation or the tests I was facing. But her confidence wasn't based on medical knowledge or careful consideration of the facts. It was based on her need to minimize my situation so that she could continue with her plans without feeling guilty. As I stood on the curb outside the departure terminal, watching Eliza drive away without a backward glance, I felt something shifting inside me that I couldn't quite identify yet. For decades, I had made excuses for her self-centered behavior, telling myself that she was busy, that she showed love in different ways, that expecting emotional support was asking too much of my successful, independent daughter. But standing there alone with my suitcase, facing the most frightening medical situation of my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with our relationship dynamic. A daughter who truly cared about her mother's well-being wouldn't leave her to face potential medical crises alone. A daughter who had received the kind of financial and emotional support I had provided over the years would find a way to return that support when it was genuinely needed. As I walked into the terminal and headed toward the check-in counter, I found myself thinking about the pattern of our interactions over the past few months. Every conversation about my health concerns had been met with dismissal or minimization. Every request for emotional support had been reframed as unnecessary dependence. Every expression of fear or anxiety had been treated as a character flaw, rather than a natural human response to a frightening situation. I didn't know it yet, but the next 24 hours were going to provide me with perfect clarity about what my relationship with Eliza was really worth. I was going to discover that the woman I had spent 35 years supporting, enabling, and prioritizing had never learned to consider anyone's needs but her own. And I was going to learn that sometimes the most painful lessons are also the most necessary ones. The medical procedures in Denver went exactly as Dr. Patterson had warned they would. The imaging tests were uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing, made worse by the fact that I was navigating them completely alone in an unfamiliar hospital. The sedation for the more invasive procedures left me groggy and disoriented for hours afterward, and the recovery process was both physically and emotionally draining. But the worst part wasn't the medical experience itself. It was the crushing loneliness of facing it without any support from the person who should have been there. As I lay in the recovery room, watching other patients being comforted by family members, I felt the full weight of Eliza's abandonment in a way that made my physical discomfort seem secondary. The test results, when Dr. Patterson finally delivered them late Wednesday afternoon, were both better and worse than I had feared. The good news was that the most serious conditions had been ruled out. The bad news was that I was facing a chronic condition that would require ongoing treatment, lifestyle changes, and regular monitoring. It wasn't life-threatening, but it was life-altering, and it meant that my fears about my health had been legitimate all along. Mrs. Ross, Dr. Patterson explained as he reviewed the results with me, this condition is very manageable with proper treatment, but it does require some significant adjustments to your daily routine and medication regimen. You'll need regular follow-up appointments, and there may be days when you don't feel well enough to handle normal activities. Do you have a good support system at home to help you navigate this transition? The question hit me like a physical blow. A good support system. The doctor was assuming that a 68-year-old woman facing a chronic medical condition would have family members ready to help her adjust to this new reality. He was assuming that someone cared enough about my well-being to ensure I had the assistance I needed. I have a daughter, I said quietly, but she's very busy with her own life. Dr. Patterson looked at me with the kind of gentle concern that medical professionals develop when they recognize a patient who lacks adequate family support. Mrs. Ross, I want to emphasize that having a strong support network is crucial for managing this condition successfully. Is there someone else, other family members, close friends, or community resources who might be able to help? The conversation was a painful reminder of how isolated I had become over the years. My focus on supporting Eliza's life and career had gradually consumed most of my time and energy, leaving little room for developing other meaningful relationships. The few close friendships I had maintained were with women my age who were dealing with their own health issues and family responsibilities. As I prepared to leave the hospital Wednesday evening, I realized that the flight home was going to be the easy part. The real challenge would be implementing the lifestyle changes Dr. Patterson had recommended while dealing with the emotional aftermath of Eliza's abandonment. But first, I had to get to the airport and navigate the journey home while still feeling the effects of the medical procedures. The taxi ride to Denver International Airport gave me time to process not just the medical diagnosis, but the deeper revelation about my relationship with Eliza. During the long, lonely hours in the hospital, I had replayed our Tuesday morning conversation over and over, and each time it became clearer that her behavior wasn't just about poor timing or conflicting priorities. It was about a fundamental lack of empathy and consideration that had probably been developing for years. My flight back to Crescent Valley was delayed by 2 hours due to weather, which meant I didn't arrive until nearly 10 p.m. The small regional airport was almost deserted by that time, with just a few other passengers from my flight and minimal staff still on duty. As I collected my luggage and headed toward the exit, I expected to find Eliza waiting for me as we had arranged. She wasn't there. I stood in the pickup area for several minutes, scanning the few cars that were circling through, but there was no sign of her vehicle. I called her cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried Alfie's number with the same result. The growing realization that they weren't coming was almost more shocking than it should have been, given how little consideration they had shown for my situation over the past few days. After waiting for 30 minutes, I called the one taxi company that served the rural area around Crescent Valley. The dispatcher informed me that they had just one driver working the late shift, and he was currently on a long-distance run that wouldn't bring him back to the airport for at least 2 hours. "Ma'am, is there anyone else who could pick you up?" the dispatcher asked kindly. "We hate to leave folks stranded at the airport, especially this late at night." Stranded. The word echoed in my mind as I hung up and realized the full scope of what Eliza had done to me. She had not only refused to provide support during my medical crisis, but she had also abandoned me at the airport upon my return, leaving me to figure out transportation home while I was still recovering from medical procedures and processing a life-changing diagnosis. I tried calling her again, and this time she answered after several rings. The background noise suggested she was in a restaurant or bar, with music and laughter clearly audible behind her voice. "Oh, Mom, I totally forgot you were coming back tonight." Her voice was bright and cheerful, with no trace of concern or apology. "Alfie and I are having dinner at this amazing place in Aspen. The food is incredible, and the view of the mountains is just breathtaking." The casual tone was like a slap across the face. While I had been sitting alone in a hospital room receiving news about a chronic medical condition, while I had been navigating medical procedures without any support, while I was now stranded at an airport late at night, Eliza was enjoying gourmet meals and mountain views without giving my situation a second thought. "Eliza, you were supposed to pick me up. We arranged this when you dropped me off Tuesday morning." "Did we? I don't remember making any specific plans about pickup. I thought you might just take a taxi or something." "Mom, you're perfectly capable of getting yourself home. You managed the whole trip by yourself, right? I told you that you were stronger than you thought." The gaslighting was breathtaking. She was not only abandoning me but rewriting history to make it seem like I had never requested her help in the first place. According to her new version of events, my expectation that she would pick me up was unreasonable, and my current situation was actually proof of the independence she had encouraged me to develop. "Eliza, I'm at the airport. It's almost 10:30 at night. The taxi company says they can't get here for at least 2 hours, and I'm still feeling the effects of the medical procedures. I need you to come get me." There was a pause, and I could hear her talking to someone else, presumably Alfie, though their conversation was muffled. When she came back on the line, her voice had shifted to a tone I recognized, the tone she used when she was about to explain why helping me was impossible. "Mom, I'm really sorry, but we're in Aspen. That's like a 5-hour drive from the airport, and we've been drinking wine with dinner. There's literally no way for us to come get you tonight. Can't you just wait for the taxi? Or maybe call one of your neighbors?" The suggestion that I call neighbors at nearly 11 p.m. to rescue me from an airport because my daughter couldn't be bothered to fulfill a basic commitment was so absurd that I almost laughed, but the laugh would have turned into tears, and I wasn't ready to break down in the middle of an airport terminal. "Eliza, when you dropped me off Tuesday morning, you knew I would need pickup arrangements for tonight. You knew I would be recovering from medical procedures. You knew I had specifically asked for your help because this was frightening for me. How could you just forget?" "Mom, I didn't forget exactly. Look, we're on our anniversary trip, and it's been really romantic and special. I wasn't thinking about anything else. Can't you understand that? This is important for my marriage." And there it was, the complete hierarchy of priorities that governed Eliza's life. Her romantic dinner was more important than her mother's medical crisis. Her anniversary trip was more important than honoring commitments to the person who had made her lifestyle possible. Her convenience was more important than my safety and well-being. But what shocked me even more than her priorities was her complete lack of awareness that there was anything wrong with them. She wasn't apologetic or embarrassed about leaving me stranded. She was mildly inconvenienced by my request for help and slightly irritated that I was interrupting her vacation with what she clearly viewed as an unreasonable expectation. "Eliza," I said quietly, "I just found out I have a chronic medical condition that's going to require ongoing treatment and lifestyle changes. I spent 2 days alone in a hospital dealing with frightening medical procedures because you couldn't postpone your vacation by 1 day. And now you've left me stranded at an airport because picking up your mother interfered with your dinner plans. Mom, you're being overly dramatic again. You said yourself that it's not life-threatening, right? And you're fine. You made it. Through the procedures, you got your answers, and now you know what you're dealing with. Everything worked out exactly like I said it would." The breathtaking selfishness and complete lack of empathy in her response was like a moment of perfect clarity. For 35 years, I had been making excuses for behavior that was actually inexcusable. I had been enabling a level of self-centeredness that had grown so extreme that Eliza could abandon her mother during a medical crisis and somehow convince herself that she was the one being inconvenienced by my expectations. As I hung up the phone and settled in to wait for the taxi that would eventually take me home to my empty house, I realized that something fundamental had shifted inside me. The woman who had spent decades prioritizing her daughter's happiness over her own well-being was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the difference between love and enablement. Eliza thought she had gotten away with abandoning me when it was convenient for her. She thought her charm and manipulation would smooth over this incident, just like they had smoothed over years of smaller betrayals and disappointments. She was about to learn how expensive that assumption would be. The taxi ride home from the airport that night was one of the longest 45 minutes of my life. Not because of the physical discomfort from the medical procedures, though that was certainly present, but because of the mental and emotional processing that was happening as I sat in the back seat of that car, watching the familiar landscape of Crescent Valley pass by in the darkness. The driver, an older gentleman named Parker who had clearly been working late shifts for years, sensed that something was wrong beyond just a delayed flight. As we drove through the quiet streets, he glanced at me in the rearview mirror with genuine concern. "Long day at the hospital?" he asked gently, apparently recognizing the medical bracelet I was still wearing from my procedures. "Something like that," I replied, not trusting my voice to say more without breaking down completely. "Family not able to pick you up?" His question was casual, but it highlighted the absurdity of my situation in a way that made the abandonment feel even more stark. "My daughter is on vacation," I said simply. And even to my own ears, the explanation sounded hollow and inadequate. Parker nodded in the kind of way that suggested he had heard similar stories before. "Well, you're home safe now. That's what matters." But as we pulled into my driveway and I saw my dark, empty house waiting for me, I realized that home safe was only the beginning of what I needed to figure out. The immediate crisis of transportation was solved, but the larger crisis of my relationship with Eliza was just beginning to unfold in my consciousness. I paid Parker, including a generous tip that he tried to refuse, and walked slowly to my front door. The house felt different as I turned on the lights and set down my suitcase. It was the same physical space I had left 3 days earlier, but my relationship to it had changed fundamentally. This was no longer the home of a woman whose primary identity was being Eliza's mother and support system. This was the home of a woman who had been abandoned during a medical crisis by the person she had spent decades prioritizing above all else. The first thing I did was check my answering machine, hoping against hope that there might be messages from Eliza expressing concern about my test results or apologizing for the airport situation. There were 7 messages, but none of them were from my daughter. 3 were from Dr. Patterson's office with appointment reminders and follow-up instructions. 2 were from neighbors who had noticed I hadn't been around and wanted to make sure I was okay. 1 was from my insurance company about coverage details. 1 was from a telemarketer. The silence from Eliza was deafening and revealing. She had managed to forget about my existence so completely during her romantic getaway that it hadn't even occurred to her to check on my medical results or confirm that I had made it home safely after she abandoned me at the airport. I sat in my living room that night, still wearing the same clothes I had traveled in, and tried to process the magnitude of what had happened over the past 3 days. The medical diagnosis was significant and would require major adjustments to my lifestyle, but it was manageable. The emotional diagnosis about my relationship with Eliza was far more devastating and would require even more significant adjustments to how I lived my life. For 35 years, I had operated under the assumption that my sacrifices for Eliza were investments in our relationship. Every time I had provided financial support, I told myself I was helping my daughter build a better life. Every time I had accommodated her schedule and priorities over my own, I told myself I was being a good mother who put her family first. Every time I had swallowed my own needs and disappointments to avoid conflict with her, I told myself I was preserving family harmony. But the past 3 days had revealed the truth about what those sacrifices had actually accomplished. Instead of building a loving, reciprocal relationship, I had trained my daughter to see me as a resource to be utilized rather than a person to be valued. Instead of teaching her about family loyalty and mutual support, I had enabled her to develop a level of selfishness that allowed her to abandon her mother during a medical crisis without experiencing any meaningful guilt or remorse. The woman sitting in that living room Wednesday night was fundamentally different from the woman who had nervously packed her suitcase Monday evening. I had crossed a line somewhere between the moment Eliza drove away from the airport Tuesday morning and the moment she casually informed me that picking me up would interfere with her dinner plans. I had moved from being someone who made excuses for unacceptable behavior to someone who finally recognized that behavior for what it was. But recognition was only the first step. The question that kept me awake that night was what to do with this new clarity. I had several options, each with different implications for my future and for my relationship with Eliza. The first option was to continue as I always had, absorbing the emotional damage and pretending that nothing significant had happened. I could write off the airport abandonment as poor planning and continue providing financial and emotional support while expecting nothing meaningful in return. This was the path of least resistance, but it was also the path that had led me to spend the most frightening medical experience of my life completely alone. The second option was to have a serious conversation with Eliza about boundaries and expectations, hoping that she might be capable of growth and change if I clearly explained how her behavior had affected me. This option appealed to the part of me that still wanted to believe our relationship could be salvaged, but the past 3 days had provided little evidence that Eliza was interested in considering anyone's perspective but her own. The third option was the most frightening but also the most honest, accepting that the relationship I thought I had with my daughter was largely fictional, and making decisions based on the reality of who she had shown herself to be, rather than who I hoped she might become. As I sat in my quiet house that night, I found myself thinking about the financial entanglements that had developed between Eliza and me over the years. The mortgage I had co-signed for her house, the business loans I had guaranteed for both her interior design company and Alfie's landscaping business, the credit cards she was authorized to use that were backed by my excellent credit score, the regular emergency funds I provided that had become so routine they were essentially subsidies for her lifestyle. For the first time, I began to consider these arrangements not as expressions of maternal love, but as enablers of the exact behavior that had just been demonstrated so clearly. Eliza had learned that she could treat me with disrespect and disregard because there were never any meaningful consequences for her actions. She had learned that my support was unconditional, regardless of how she treated me, because I had trained her to expect that level of tolerance. But what if that changed? What if the woman who had been abandoned at an airport decided that unconditional support required at least basic consideration in return? What if the mother who had spent decades enabling selfish behavior decided that enabling wasn't actually loving? The medical procedures had revealed that my health concerns were legitimate and would require ongoing attention. But they had also revealed something far more important. I was stronger and more capable than I had given myself credit for. I had navigated a frightening medical situation completely alone, and I had survived it. I had handled complex procedures and difficult diagnoses without the support I had thought I needed. If I could handle a medical crisis independently, perhaps I could also handle the crisis of setting boundaries with a daughter who had never learned to respect them. By Thursday morning, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to stop enabling Eliza's selfishness and start protecting my own well-being. I was going to find out what our relationship looked like when it was based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. I was going to discover whether Eliza was capable of loving me for who I was rather than for what I could provide. And if she wasn't, I was going to learn to build a life that didn't revolve around earning affection from someone who had never learned to give it freely. The woman who had been abandoned at the airport was about to teach her daughter a lesson about consequences that was 35 years overdue. Whether Eliza learned from that lesson or not would determine what kind of relationship, if any, we would have going forward. But for the first time in decades, That outcome would be determined by Eliza's choices rather than my willingness to accept unacceptable behavior. The reckoning was about to begin. Thursday morning brought a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, and for the first time in decades, I wasn't immediately thinking about what Eliza might need from me or how I could better support her latest project or crisis. Instead, I was thinking about myself, my health, my needs, and the patterns that had led to my abandonment at the airport just 2 nights earlier. I made coffee and settled at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a calculator. If I was going to change the dynamic between Eliza and me, I needed to understand the full scope of what that dynamic had become. I needed documentation, not just emotions, to guide my decisions going forward. What I discovered during those hours of careful calculation was both shocking and illuminating. Over the past 10 years alone, my financial support to Eliza and Alfie had totaled over $300,000. This wasn't including the smaller, regular loans that had never been repaid, the credit cards I guaranteed, or the countless services I had provided, free of charge. The house in Willowbrook Hills that they were so proud of had been purchased with a $75,000 down payment I had provided, plus my co-signature on a mortgage they couldn't have qualified for on their own income. When they had decided the house needed updating 2 years later, I had provided another $45,000 for renovations that had transformed their modest purchase into a showcase property that now anchored their social status in the community. Eliza's interior design business, Willowbrook Interiors, had been launched with $40,000 in startup capital from my retirement savings. When the business had struggled in its second year, I had provided an additional $25,000 to keep it afloat. When she had wanted to expand into commercial projects, I had guaranteed a business line of credit for $60,000 that had allowed her to take on bigger clients and more prestigious projects. Alfie's landscaping company had required even more substantial support. When Alpine Gardens was facing bankruptcy during the recession, I had provided $80,000 in emergency funding to cover payroll and equipment costs. When they had decided to expand into high-end residential projects, I had co-signed equipment loans totaling $55,000 for specialized machinery and vehicles. But the financial support was only part of the pattern I was beginning to recognize. As I continued my documentation, I realized that my role in their lives had extended far beyond just providing money. I had become their unpaid consultant, bookkeeper, emergency contact, and general problem solver for every aspect of their business and personal lives. When clients were slow to pay their invoices, I provided bridge loans to cover their cash flow problems. When they needed professional references for business applications, I leveraged my reputation and contacts in the community. When they wanted to join the exclusive Crescent Valley Country Club, but couldn't afford the initiation fees, I had provided the $15,000 required for membership that gave them access to the wealthy, clients who had made their businesses so successful. The pattern extended to their personal lives as well. Anniversary trips to Aspen, funded by me when they claimed their businesses couldn't afford such luxuries. Alfie's motorcycle and Eliza's luxury car, both purchased with loans I had co-signed when their credit wasn't sufficient. Even their weekly date nights at expensive restaurants had become possible because I regularly provided grocery money that freed up their entertainment budget. As I tallied the numbers, I began to understand why Eliza had felt so comfortable abandoning me during my medical crisis. In her mind, I wasn't a person with my own needs and vulnerabilities. I was a financial institution that happened to be related to her. Banks don't need emotional support. ATMs don't require gratitude or consideration. Resources don't have feelings that need to be taken into account. But the most painful pattern I identified was the complete absence of reciprocity in our relationship. I spent hours going through my calendar and phone records, trying to find evidence of times when Eliza had provided support to me. The results were devastating in their scarcity. When I had been dealing with my late husband's final illness 5 years earlier, Eliza had visited exactly twice, both times bringing her own problems that needed discussion and solutions. When I had fallen and sprained my ankle badly 2 years ago, she had offered to help by giving me the phone number of a grocery delivery service rather than actually assisting me herself. When I had been going through a difficult period of grief and depression after losing several close friends in a short period, she had suggested that I find some hobbies to keep myself busy instead of offering emotional support or companionship. The Rhine pattern was clear and consistent. I was expected to be available for any crisis, need, or opportunity that arose in Eliza's life. But my own crises, needs, and vulnerabilities were inconveniences that she preferred I handle independently. I had trained her to see our relationship as a one-way street, where love flowed downward from parent to offspring, but never returned in any meaningful form. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of my analysis was what I discovered about Eliza's actual financial situation versus the lifestyle she was maintaining. Using the business records I had helped her organize and the tax documents I had assisted with over the years, I calculated that their combined legitimate income was approximately $85,000 annually, yet their lifestyle expenses, mortgage, car payments, insurance, club memberships, vacation spending, and general living costs totaled over $140,000 per year. The $55,000 annual gap between their income and expenses was being covered entirely by my ongoing support. Without my subsidies, they would be facing bankruptcy within months. Their entire social status, business reputation, and comfortable lifestyle was built on a foundation of my financial support that they had come to see as an entitlement rather than a gift. This realization was both devastating and empowering. Devastating because it confirmed that their affection for me was largely transactional, based on what I provided rather than who I was as a person. Empowering because it meant I held far more leverage in our relationship than I had ever understood or been willing to use. As I compiled my documentation, I also began researching the legal implications of the various financial arrangements I had entered into over the years. What I discovered was that most of the loans I had made to them were informal agreements with no legal enforcement mechanisms. The business guarantees I had provided could be withdrawn with proper notice. The co-signed loans could be transferred to other guarantors if the primary borrowers qualified for refinancing. In other words, the financial entanglements that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable were actually quite flexible, if I was willing to exercise my rights and enforce boundaries that I had never established before. But the most important pattern I recognized during those hours of analysis was within myself. For decades, I had confused enabling with loving financial support with emotional connection, and being needed with being valued. I had allowed my identity to become so intertwined with Eliza's success and happiness that I had lost sight of my own worth as an individual. The woman who had been abandoned at the airport was the logical result of years of teaching my daughter that my needs were less important than her wants, that my feelings were less significant than her convenience, and that my well-being was less worthy of consideration than her comfort. But the woman sitting at that kitchen table Thursday morning was different. She was someone who had survived a medical crisis independently and was now capable of conducting a clear-eyed analysis of relationship patterns that had been decades in the making. She was someone who could calculate financial data without being swayed by emotional manipulation. She was someone who was ready to make decisions based on reality rather than hope. By Thursday afternoon, I had a complete picture of how my relationship with Eliza had developed into a pattern of exploitation that was harmful to both of us. I had enabled her selfishness while sacrificing my own well-being, and the result was a daughter who was incapable of genuine empathy or reciprocal love. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. The woman who had spent 35 years enabling destructive behavior was about to discover what happened when she stopped. The analysis phase was complete. It was time to begin implementing changes that would either transform our relationship or reveal its true nature once and for all. Friday morning marked the beginning of what I had decided to call my independence initiative. Unlike the emotional responses Eliza had probably expected from me over the years, this was going to be a methodical, professional approach to restructuring our relationship based on the financial and emotional data I had compiled. My first call was to my attorney, Jessie Morgan, a sharp woman in her 50s who had handled my legal affairs since my husband's death. Jessie had always been straightforward with me, and I knew she would give me honest advice about the implications of what I was planning to do. "Vivian," Jessie said when I explained the situation, "I have to ask, are you certain you want to pursue this course of action? Once you start withdrawing from these financial arrangements, it's going to be very difficult to reverse the process, and it will likely have serious consequences for your daughter's business and personal finances." "Jessie," I replied, "my daughter abandoned me at the airport after a medical procedure because picking me up would have interfered with her dinner plans. She left me stranded there while she was enjoying wine and mountain views in Aspen. I think it's time she learned what consequences actually look like." There was a pause before Jessie responded, and when she did, her voice had shifted to purely professional mode. "All right then, let's talk about your options and the timeline for implementing changes." We spent 2 hours going through every financial arrangement I had with Eliza and Alfie. Jessie explained the legal procedures for withdrawing from co-signed agreements, calling in informal loans, and terminating business guarantees. More importantly, she helped me understand the timeline and proper notification requirements to ensure everything was done legally and ethically. "The business line of credit you guaranteed has a 30-day notification clause for guarantor withdrawal," Jessie explained. "The equipment loans have similar provisions. The mortgage co-signature is more complex because it would require them to qualify for refinancing on their own, but you can certainly request removal as a co-signer." "What about the informal loans, the money I provided without formal agreements?" Jessie smiled grimly. "Those are more challenging to enforce legally, but they're also easier for you to address directly. You can simply stop providing additional funds and request repayment of existing amounts. Whether they comply is up to them, but at least you'll have established clear boundaries." The second call was to my financial advisor, Clara Henderson, who had been managing my investment portfolio since I had started taking early distributions to fund Eliza's various projects. Clara had never directly questioned my financial decisions, but I had sensed her disapproval when I had repeatedly withdrawn funds from my retirement accounts to support my daughter's lifestyle. "Clara," I said, "I need to make some significant changes to how I'm managing my finances. I want to stop all distributions that aren't for my own living expenses, and I need to understand how to protect my assets from any potential claims or demands. Vivian, may I ask what's prompted this change in approach?" I gave her a brief summary of the airport abandonment and my analysis of the financial patterns. Clara listened without interruption, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Vivian, I'm going to say something I probably should have said years ago. The level of financial support you've been providing to your daughter has been unsustainable and potentially harmful to your long-term financial security. You're 68 years old with a new medical condition that will involve ongoing costs. You need to be prioritizing your own financial stability." Clara's validation of my concerns was both relieving and sobering. I had been so focused on supporting Eliza's dreams that I had lost sight of my own financial needs and security. The chronic medical condition I was now facing would require expensive treatments and potentially limit my ability to earn income in the future. "What do you recommend as next steps?" I asked. "First, we need to immediately stop all discretionary distributions from your accounts. Second, we should establish a separate account for your medical expenses that can't be accessed for any other purposes. Third, we need to review your beneficiary designations to ensure your assets are protected according to your current wishes, rather than outdated assumptions about family relationships. The third call was the most difficult, to my insurance company to understand the implications of removing myself from various policies where I was listed as a guarantor or primary policyholder for Eliza's benefit. The business insurance policies for both Willowbrook Interiors and Alpine Gardens were backed by my personal guarantee, which meant I was financially responsible if they defaulted on payments. The insurance representative explained that removing my guarantees would require the businesses to qualify for coverage based on their own financial standing and credit ratings. Given what I now knew about their actual income versus expenses, this was likely to result in significantly higher premiums or potential denial of coverage altogether. By Friday afternoon, I had initiated the legal and financial processes that would fundamentally change Eliza's access to my resources. Jesse had prepared formal notification letters for all the business guarantees and co-signed agreements. Clara had restructured my accounts to prevent unauthorized access and established clear boundaries around my available assets. The insurance companies had been notified of my intent to withdraw from guarantee arrangements. But the most important step was still ahead of me, determining how and when to inform Eliza about these changes. I had several options, each with different strategic implications. I could wait until she returned from Aspen and confront her directly about her behavior, using the financial consequences as leverage to demand better treatment. This approach appealed to the part of me that wanted her to understand the connection between her actions and their results. I could implement all the changes quietly and let her discover them when she tried to access credit or encountered financial difficulties. This approach would demonstrate the real-world consequences of taking my support for granted without giving her an opportunity to manipulate me into reversing my decisions. I could call her immediately and explain exactly what I was doing and why, giving her a chance to apologize and potentially change her behavior before the financial consequences took effect. This approach offered the possibility of reconciliation, but also the risk that she would focus on manipulating me rather than examining her own behavior. After much consideration, I decided on a hybrid approach that would maximize both the educational value and the protective benefits of my actions. I would implement all the financial changes immediately, but inform Eliza about them in a carefully planned conversation that made clear the connection between her behavior and these consequences. Saturday afternoon, I sat down to write the most important letter I had ever composed. It wasn't a legal document or a business communication. It was a mother's final attempt to teach her daughter about respect, gratitude, and the true meaning of family relationships. The letter began, "Dear Eliza, by the time you read this, several significant changes will have been made to our financial arrangements. These changes are not punitive, but they are necessary consequences of your decision to abandon me during a medical crisis, because helping me would have interfered with your vacation plans." I went on to detail every financial arrangement I was terminating, every guarantee I was withdrawing, and every form of support that would no longer be available. But more importantly, I explained the pattern of behavior that had led to these decisions and the impact her selfishness had had on my well-being over the years. The letter concluded, "I love you, Eliza, but I have finally learned the difference between loving someone and enabling their worst impulses. If you want to rebuild our relationship, it will need to be based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than financial transactions and one-sided sacrifice. The choice is yours." As I sealed the letter and prepared to mail it to their Aspen hotel, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of personal power and self-respect that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or gratitude. The strategic action phase was complete. Now it was time to discover what Eliza would choose when the financial foundation of our relationship was removed, and only the possibility of genuine connection remained. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport was about to find out whether her daughter was capable of love that didn't come with a price tag attached. The letter reached Eliza and Alfie at their luxury resort in Aspen on Monday morning, exactly 4 days after they had abandoned me at the airport. I know this because my phone started ringing at 7:23 a.m. with a call from an unknown Colorado number that went straight to voicemail when I didn't answer. By the time I checked my messages an hour later, there were already 6 increasingly frantic voicemails waiting for me. The first message was Eliza's voice, tight with what sounded like panic. "Mom, I just got your letter. This is crazy. You can't be serious about this. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about this misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding told me everything I needed to know about how she was processing the situation. In Eliza's mind, my clear-eyed response to her abandonment was just a miscommunication that could be resolved with the right combination of charm and manipulation. The messages that followed showed a rapid escalation from confusion to anger to desperation. By the 6th voicemail, recorded just 40 minutes after the first, Eliza's voice had completely lost its carefully controlled tone. "Mom, what you're doing is vindictive and cruel. You're going to destroy our businesses over a petty disagreement. About airport pickup? This isn't like you at all. Something is seriously wrong, and we need to get you some help when we get back." The suggestion that I needed help for making rational business decisions about my own money was both predictable and revealing. Rather than examining her own behavior or acknowledging any responsibility for the situation, Eliza was already working to reframe my response as evidence of mental instability that needed professional intervention. I didn't return any of the calls that Monday, partly because I wanted time to observe how the situation would develop without my input, but mostly because I had learned enough about manipulation tactics to recognize that engaging with Eliza while she was in crisis mode would only give her opportunities to wear down my resolve. Tuesday brought a new strategy. Instead of the panicked voicemails, I received a series of carefully crafted text messages that showed Eliza had spent time thinking about her approach. The messages came every few hours, each one designed to appeal to a different aspect of my personality and history with her. 15 a.m. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you wrote, and I realize I may have hurt your feelings more than I understood. Can we please talk about this rationally when we get home? I love you so much." 1:30 p.m. I spoke with Alfie, and we both agree that we could have handled the airport situation better. We're willing to apologize and make it up to you. Please don't destroy everything we've worked for over one mistake. 6:45 p.m. "Mom, you raised me to believe that family helps each other through difficult times. I'm asking you to be the bigger person here and give us a chance to make this right before you do something irreversible." Each message was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for protecting my own interests while simultaneously minimizing the severity of what they had done to me. The progression from hurt feelings to one mistake to appeals about being the bigger person showed that Eliza was deploying every tool in her arsenal to restore the status quo without actually acknowledging any meaningful wrongdoing. Wednesday brought reinforcements. My phone rang at 2 p.m. with a call from Alfie, which surprised me because he rarely initiated contact with me directly. His approach was notably different from Eliza's emotional manipulation. He tried to appeal to my business sense and practical nature. "Vivian," he said, using the formal tone he employed when he was trying to sound mature and responsible, "I think there may be some miscommunication about the financial arrangements you're changing. Eliza is really upset, and I'm trying to understand what exactly happened to cause such a drastic response." The word drastic was interesting. Apparently, removing financial support from people who had abandoned me during a medical crisis was an overreaction in Alfie's worldview. "There's no miscommunication, Alfie," I replied calmly. "Your wife left me stranded at an airport because picking me up would have interfered with your dinner plans. I've decided that people who treat me that way don't deserve unlimited access to my financial resources. But Vivian, you have to understand the position this puts us in. The business loans, the mortgage, the credit lines, they're all connected. If you withdraw your support suddenly like this, we could lose everything. Our house, our businesses, our reputation in the community. The appeal to consequences was classic Alfie. He had always been more direct than Eliza about the transactional nature of our relationship. In his mind, the potential financial hardship they would face was more important than the emotional damage they had inflicted on me. Alfie, you should have considered those consequences before you decided that my well-being was less important than your vacation schedule. That's not fair, he said, and I could hear real frustration creeping into his voice. We've always been grateful for your support. We've never taken it for granted. This situation got blown out of proportion, and now you're punishing us financially for what was essentially a miscommunication about logistics. The reframing was breathtaking. According to Alfie, abandoning me at an airport was a miscommunication about logistics rather than a fundamental failure of empathy and responsibility. The fact that they had never taken my support for granted was apparently evidenced by their willingness to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars in assistance, while providing virtually nothing in return. Thursday brought the most revealing development yet. I received a call from Sophie Cook, Eliza's business partner and closest friend, who had apparently been recruited to serve as an intermediary in their campaign to restore my financial support. Mrs. Ross, Sophie began, her voice carefully modulated, to sound concerned rather than confrontational. Eliza asked me to call because she's really worried about you. She thinks you might be dealing with some health issues that are affecting your judgment. The suggestion that my medical condition was impairing my decision-making abilities was a new low, even for Eliza. Rather than acknowledging that she had behaved badly, she was now questioning my mental competency as a way to avoid taking responsibility for the consequences of her actions. Sophie, I said, my judgment is perfectly clear. Clear enough to recognize that my daughter abandoned me during a medical crisis because helping me would have been inconvenient for her vacation plans. But Mrs. Ross, I think there might be some misunderstanding about what actually happened. Eliza said it was just a miscommunication about pickup arrangements, and she feels terrible about how it worked out. The fact that Eliza was spreading a revised version of events to her friends and business associates revealed how far she was willing to go to avoid accountability. In her new narrative, apparently, I had simply misunderstood the pickup arrangements rather than being deliberately abandoned when I needed help. Sophie, I was left stranded at an airport at 10:30 at night after medical procedures because Eliza was having dinner in Aspen and couldn't be bothered to honor her commitment to pick me up. That's not a miscommunication. That's abandonment. The conversation with Sophie confirmed what I had suspected. Eliza was not just trying to manipulate me into reversing my financial decisions, but was also working to control the narrative about what had happened. She was telling her friends and business associates that I was overreacting to a simple misunderstanding, probably in preparation for the possibility that she would need their support if my financial withdrawal created problems for her business. Friday brought the most desperate escalation yet. I received a call from Dr. Patterson's office in Denver, asking if I wanted to schedule a follow-up appointment to discuss my family concerns about cognitive changes following your recent procedures. It took me several minutes to understand what had happened. Eliza had apparently called my doctor's office and expressed concern that the medical procedures had affected my mental state, as evidenced by my sudden personality changes and irrational financial decisions. The breathtaking audacity of using my own medical information to undermine my credibility was a new level of manipulation that I hadn't anticipated. Eliza was so desperate to restore access to my money that she was willing to involve my healthcare providers in her campaign to have my decisions declared medically unsound. When I called Dr. Patterson's office back to clarify the situation, the nurse was apologetic, but explained that they had to take family concerns about cognitive changes seriously, especially in older patients who had undergone sedation. Dr. Patterson would like to schedule a brief consultation to assess your current cognitive function and ensure that you're making informed decisions about any major life changes, the nurse explained. I agreed to the appointment, partly because I wanted to clear up any confusion about my mental state, but mostly because I realized that Eliza's willingness to involve my medical team revealed just how far she was prepared to go to avoid facing the consequences of her behavior. The woman who had abandoned me at an airport was now trying to have me declared mentally incompetent rather than admit that she had treated me badly. The escalation was both shocking and illuminating. It showed me exactly what our relationship was worth to someone who had never learned to value anything beyond her own convenience and comfort. But it also showed me that my decision to withdraw financial support was having exactly the impact I had intended. Eliza was finally experiencing consequences for her behavior, and her increasingly desperate responses revealed just how little she understood about respect, accountability, or genuine relationships. The resistance phase was proving more educational than I had expected. It was teaching me not just about Eliza's character, but about my own strength and resolve. The woman who had spent decades avoiding conflict was discovering that she was perfectly capable of withstanding manipulation, threats, and even attacks on her mental competency. The real test was just beginning. The appointment with Dr. Patterson, the following Tuesday, was both validating and infuriating. After a comprehensive cognitive assessment that included memory tests, reasoning evaluations, and a detailed review of my medical history, Dr. Patterson confirmed what I already knew. My mental faculties were not only intact, but functioning at a high level for someone my age. "Mrs. Ross," he said as we concluded the appointment, "I want to be very clear about something. Your cognitive function is excellent. Your decision-making capacity is unimpaired, and your recent medical procedures would have had no lasting effects on your mental clarity. Whoever suggested otherwise was either misinformed or had other motivations for questioning your competency." The validation was satisfying, but what troubled me was that Eliza had been willing to attack my mental competency rather than examine her own behavior. It revealed a level of desperation and moral flexibility that I was still struggling to accept about my own daughter. By the time I returned home from Denver, the first wave of real consequences was beginning to manifest in Eliza and Alfie's financial situation. Jesse had been efficient in processing the legal notifications, and the responses from various financial institutions were already arriving in my mailbox. The business line of credit that had allowed Willowbrook Interiors to take on larger projects was being terminated due to my withdrawal as guarantor. Without my financial backing, Eliza's credit history alone wasn't sufficient to maintain the $60,000 credit line that had become essential to her business operations. The bank was offering to continue the arrangement at a significantly reduced limit of $15,000 and with an interest rate nearly double what they had been paying. Alpine Gardens was facing even more severe consequences. The equipment loans I had co-signed were being called for immediate renegotiation, and without my guarantee, Alfie would need to either find alternative financing or surrender the specialized machinery that had allowed his business to compete for high-end contracts. The preliminary assessment from the bank suggested that his company's actual financial position wouldn't support the existing loan amounts. But the most immediate crisis was developing around their mortgage. The refinancing application that Robert R. had mentioned during my Hawaii trip — apparently Eliza and Alfie had been pursuing a similar strategy to reduce their monthly payments — had been automatically denied when the lender discovered I was withdrawing as co-signer. Their current mortgage, which they had been managing with difficulty even with my regular subsidies, was now their only option, and the payments were consuming nearly 60% of their legitimate monthly income. Wednesday afternoon brought the phone call I had been expecting. Eliza's voice was different from the panicked or manipulative tones of the previous week. Now she sounded tired, defeated, and for the first time genuinely frightened. "Mom," she said quietly, "we need to talk. We're back from Aspen and they're really bad. Can I come over?" "Of course," I replied, curious to see what approach she would take now that the financial consequences were becoming undeniably real. She arrived an hour later, alone, which surprised me. Alfie had been her backup and moral support for difficult conversations for years. and his absence suggested that this might be a different kind of conversation than we had grown accustomed to having. Eliza looked exhausted in a way that went beyond mere fatigue. The confident, successful businesswoman who had driven away from the airport 2 weeks earlier had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely shaken by the reality of what was happening to her carefully constructed lifestyle. "Mom," she began, settling into the same chair where she had dismissed my medical concerns just weeks earlier. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding about what happened at the airport, and it's gotten completely out of control." Even in crisis, she was still trying to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging her own behavior. But there was something different in her tone. Less certainty, more vulnerability. "Eliza, there was no misunderstanding. You abandoned me at an airport because picking me up would have interfered with your dinner plans. That's exactly what happened, and we both know it." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with something internally. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I had heard it in years. "Okay, maybe I didn't handle the airport situation as well as I could have. Maybe I was too focused on our trip and not focused enough on what you needed. But Mom, what you're doing now, it's going to destroy everything Alfie and I have worked for. We could lose our house, our businesses, everything." The admission that she hadn't handled the situation well was the closest thing to an apology I had received, but it was still framed in terms of the consequences to her rather than the impact on me. "Eliza," I said gently, "what you and Alfie have worked for was built on a foundation of my financial support. If that foundation is removed and everything collapses, perhaps it wasn't as solid as you believed. But that's not fair," she said, and real tears were forming in her eyes now. "We've been grateful for your help. We've always appreciated everything you've done for us." "Have you? When was the last time you expressed that appreciation in any meaningful way? When was the last time you considered my needs when they conflicted with your wants?" The questions hung in the air between us, and I could see Eliza struggling to find examples that would support her claim. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before she tried a different approach. "Mom, I know I haven't been the perfect daughter. I know I've been selfish sometimes, but completely cutting off all financial support, isn't that a little extreme? Couldn't we work out some kind of arrangement where you reduce your help gradually instead of just pulling everything away at once?" The negotiation attempt was predictable, but what interested me was the admission that she had been selfish sometimes. In Eliza's mind, apparently, decades of one-sided exploitation qualified as occasional selfishness that could be overlooked for the sake of maintaining her financial security. "Eliza, the financial arrangements I'm terminating weren't gifts or family support. They were enablers of behavior that was harmful to both of us. I enabled your selfishness by cushioning you from the consequences of your choices, and you enabled my codependency by accepting my support without ever learning to reciprocate." "Codependency?" she repeated, seeming genuinely confused by the term. "I made my sense of worth dependent on being needed by you, and you made your lifestyle dependent on my unlimited financial support. That's not a healthy family relationship. That's a dysfunctional business arrangement disguised as love." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Eliza alternating between acknowledgments of her past behavior and attempts to negotiate partial restoration of my financial support. What became clear was that she was finally beginning to understand the scope of how dependent her lifestyle had become on my subsidies, but she was still primarily focused on finding ways to restore that dependence rather than examining why it had developed in the first place. The most revealing moment came when she asked, "Mom, what do you want from me? What would I need to do to fix this?" The question showed that she still viewed the situation as a problem to be solved, rather than a relationship to be rebuilt. In her mind, there must be some specific action she could take, some gesture she could make that would restore access to my financial resources. "Eliza," I said, "I don't want anything from you except genuine consideration and respect. I want a relationship where my needs matter as much as yours, where my feelings are taken into account before decisions are made, and where love flows in both directions instead of just from me to you. But how do I demonstrate that? How do I prove that I've changed? You don't prove it, Eliza. You live it. You build it over time through consistent actions that show you value our relationship for reasons beyond what I can provide financially. She left that evening without any commitments from me about restoring financial support, but also without the anger and manipulation that had characterized her earlier attempts to change my mind. For the first time, she seemed to be grappling with the possibility that the consequences she was facing were connected to choices she had made rather than arbitrary punishment I was inflicting. Over the following weeks, the financial pressure on Eliza and Alfie continued to intensify. Willowbrook Interiors had to turn down several large projects because they couldn't afford the upfront costs without their previous credit line. Alpine Gardens lost a major commercial contract when they couldn't provide the equipment guarantees the client required. But something else began to happen that I hadn't fully anticipated. Stripped of the financial cushion that had allowed them to take risks and live beyond their means, both Eliza and Alfie began to develop skills and resourcefulness they had never needed before. Eliza started handling her business finances more carefully, negotiating better payment terms with clients, and finding creative ways to manage cash flow without relying on credit. Alfie began focusing on smaller, more profitable projects that didn't require expensive equipment or large upfront investments. More importantly, they began to understand the actual value of what they had been taking for granted, the financial security that had allowed them to pursue their dreams, take risks, and maintain their lifestyle hadn't been their achievement. It had been mine, generously shared, but never truly appreciated. The natural consequences were teaching them lessons about independence, resourcefulness, and gratitude that 35 years of my enabling had never provided. Whether they would learn those lessons completely and apply them to our relationship remained to be seen. But for the first time since Eliza had become an adult, she was experiencing the real world without my financial buffer. The question now was whether that experience would teach her to value what she had lost, or simply motivate her to find alternative sources of support that didn't require genuine reciprocity. 3 months after the airport abandonment, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and liberating. For the first time in over 3 decades, my daily routine wasn't structured around Eliza's needs, crises, or requests for support. I woke up each morning thinking about my own priorities, my own health, and my own happiness. A luxury I had forgotten was possible. The medical condition Dr. Patterson had diagnosed was responding well to treatment, partly because I was finally able to focus on my own self-care without the constant distraction of managing someone else's financial and emotional crises. The stress reduction alone had been remarkable. Without the underlying anxiety of wondering what crisis Eliza would present next, or how much my latest loan would impact my own financial security, I felt calmer and more centered than I had in years. My daily routine had evolved to include activities that brought me genuine pleasure rather than obligation. I had joined a book club at the Crescent Valley Library, where I met other women my age who were navigating their own relationships with adult children and aging parents. The conversations were refreshing in their honesty. These women understood the challenges of maintaining boundaries with family members who had learned to see them as resources rather than people. I had also begun volunteering at the Willowbrook Community Center, helping senior citizens navigate healthcare paperwork and insurance issues. The work was meaningful and utilized the organizational skills I had developed during my years in business. But more importantly, it connected me with people who appreciated my assistance without taking it for granted. The gratitude expressed by the seniors I helped was genuine and immediate, so different from the entitled acceptance that had characterized Eliza's response to my support over the years. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with money itself. For decades, my financial resources had felt like a burden, something that created obligations and complicated relationships. Now, with clear boundaries in place, my money had become a tool for creating the life I wanted rather than subsidizing someone else's dreams at the expense of my own security. Clara Henderson, my financial advisor, had been monitoring my accounts closely since the restructuring, and the numbers told a remarkable story. In just 3 months, without the constant drain of supporting Eliza's lifestyle, my savings had begun to rebuild. The medical expenses I had been worried about were easily manageable within my actual budget. For the first time in years, I was living within my means rather than depleting my assets to fund someone else's overspending. "Vivian," Clara said during our quarterly review, "I want you to see something interesting in these numbers. Without the financial outflows to your daughter, you're not just maintaining your current lifestyle, you're actually able to save money each month. Your retirement security has improved dramatically." The implications were sobering. For years, I had been jeopardizing my own financial future to enable Eliza's present comfort. The retirement funds I had depleted to support her business ventures and lifestyle could have grown substantially if I had invested them for my own future instead. The debt I had taken on through co-signing arrangements had been putting my own assets at risk for the benefit of people who had never demonstrated genuine appreciation for the sacrifice. But the financial improvements, while significant, were secondary to the emotional transformation I was experiencing. The constant low-level anxiety that had characterized my relationship with Eliza, wondering when the next crisis would arise, worrying about whether I was being too generous or not generous enough, feeling guilty when I hesitated to provide. Support had been replaced by a sense of peace and self-respect that I hadn't realized I was missing. The change in my social relationships was particularly striking. Without the consuming focus on Eliza's needs, I had time and emotional energy to invest in friendships that were reciprocal and nurturing. Eden Howard, a woman I had met at the book club, had become a close friend who understood the challenges of setting boundaries with adult children. Her own son had struggled with substance abuse for years, and she had learned the hard way that enabling his behavior wasn't helping him recover. "Vivian," Eden said during one of our weekly coffee meetings, "the hardest lesson I learned was that loving someone and helping them aren't always the same thing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable behavior that's harmful to both of you." These conversations with Eden and other women who had faced similar challenges helped me understand that my experience with Eliza wasn't unique. Many parents, particularly mothers, struggled with the balance between support and enablement. The difference was that some learned to recognize the pattern before it became as destructive as mine had become. The relationship dynamics I was observing in my volunteer work were also illuminating. The seniors I helped often shared stories about their own family relationships, and I began to recognize patterns that mirrored my experience with Eliza. Adult children who visited only when they needed something. Grandchildren who expressed affection primarily around birthdays and holidays when gifts were expected. Family members who measured love by financial contributions rather than emotional connection. But I also met seniors who had different stories. Families where adult children provided genuine care and support, where grandchildren visited because they enjoyed their grandparents' company, where financial assistance flowed in both directions based on need rather than entitlement. These examples showed me what healthy family relationships could look like, and reinforced my belief that the dysfunction I had experienced with Eliza wasn't inevitable or normal. The most unexpected aspect of this period was how my relationship with Eliza began to evolve once the financial pressure was removed from our interactions. Without the underlying agenda of securing or maintaining access to my resources, our conversations became more honest, though also more infrequent. About 6 weeks after our difficult conversation in my living room, Eliza called to ask if she could stop by to talk. She had been calling weekly since returning from Aspen, but this was the first time she had requested an in-person meeting since that initial crisis conversation. When she arrived, I immediately noticed changes in her appearance and demeanor. She looked tired in a way that suggested genuine stress rather than mere inconvenience. Her usually perfectly styled hair and carefully chosen outfit had been replaced by a more casual, less polished presentation. But more significantly, she seemed smaller somehow, less confident, more uncertain. "Mom?" she began, settling into the chair that had become her usual spot during our difficult conversations. "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks, and I need to tell you some things." The tone was different from any I had heard from her in years, less defensive, more reflective. I waited for her to continue, curious about what approach she might take. "I've been talking to a counselor," she said, which surprised me. Eliza had always been skeptical of therapy, viewing it as an admission of weakness or failure. "Alfie and I have been having problems since we got back from Aspen, and I thought it was because of the financial stress. But the counselor helped me understand that the problems are deeper than that." This was more self-awareness than Eliza had demonstrated in years, and I found myself cautiously hopeful about where the conversation might lead. The counselor asked me to describe our relationship, yours and mine, and when I tried to explain it, I realized that most of my stories were about things you had done for me or given to me. I couldn't think of many examples of things I had done for you, or times when I had put your needs ahead of mine. The admission was both painful and encouraging. Painful because it confirmed the one-sided nature of our relationship that I had finally acknowledged. Encouraging because it suggested that Eliza was capable of recognizing patterns that she had previously been unable or unwilling to see. The counselor also asked me about the airport situation, and when I explained what happened, she helped me understand why you reacted the way you did. I think I've been telling myself that it wasn't that big a deal, because acknowledging how badly I treated you would mean admitting that I'm not the person I thought I was. This level of introspection was unprecedented in my experience with Eliza. She had spent years deflecting criticism and avoiding accountability, but now she seemed to be genuinely grappling with the impact of her behavior. "Mom, I want to apologize for abandoning you at the airport. Not because I want you to restore the financial support, though obviously the money situation is really difficult, but because I finally understand how much I hurt you. You were scared about your medical tests. You specifically asked for my help, and I chose my vacation over your needs. That was selfish and cruel, and I'm sorry." The apology was more complete and genuine than anything I had received from her in decades. She acknowledged the specific behavior, accepted responsibility for her choices, and recognized the impact on me without minimizing or deflecting. It was exactly the kind of accountability I had hoped for, but never expected to receive. "I also want you to know that I understand why you changed the financial arrangements. The counselor helped me see that you weren't punishing me. You were protecting yourself from being hurt the same way again." She called it natural consequences, and she said that experiencing those consequences might actually help me learn to be a better person. The fact that a professional had validated my approach was gratifying, but more important was Eliza's apparent willingness to accept those consequences as learning opportunities rather than undeserved punishment. "Mom, I know I can't undo the damage I've done to our relationship, and I know I can't expect you to trust me again right away. But I want to try to rebuild our relationship in a different way, a way that doesn't revolve around money or what you can do for me." The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, and it was unlike any we had shared since Eliza had become an adult. Instead of her presenting problems for me to solve or crises for me to address, she talked about what she was learning about herself, about the changes she and Alfie were making to their lifestyle and expectations, and about her genuine desire to develop a more balanced relationship with me. She told me about the counseling sessions where she had begun to understand how her behavior had been shaped by knowing that I would always be available to solve her problems. She described the financial adjustments she and Alfie were making, downsizing their lifestyle, focusing on more profitable business strategies, and learning to live within their actual means rather than the artificial budget created by my subsidies. Most importantly, she talked about the emotional work she was doing to understand empathy and reciprocity in relationships. The counselor had given her exercises to practice considering other people's perspectives and needs, and she was beginning to recognize how rarely she had applied those skills to our relationship. The hardest thing the counselor asked me to do was to imagine how I would feel if someone treated me the way I've treated you, Eliza said near the end of our conversation. If I had a daughter who only called when she needed money, who dismissed my health concerns, who abandoned me when helping me was inconvenient, I would be devastated. I would feel used and unloved and completely taken for granted. The exercise had apparently been effective in helping her understand the emotional damage her behavior had caused over the years. For the first time, she seemed to grasp that my feelings and needs were as legitimate and important as her own. Mom, I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me completely, and I understand if you can't. But I want you to know that I'm committed to becoming someone who deserves your love, rather than just expecting it because I'm your daughter. As Eliza prepared to leave that evening, something felt fundamentally different between us. The conversation hadn't resolved everything, and I certainly wasn't ready to restore the financial arrangements that had enabled her previous behavior. But for the first time in decades, I felt like I had been talking to a daughter who was capable of genuine growth and change, rather than someone who was simply trying to manipulate me into providing what she wanted. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport was beginning to see evidence that her daughter might be capable of learning the lessons that experience was meant to teach. Whether that growth would continue and lead to a genuinely healthy relationship remained to be seen, but for the first time in years, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility. The new equilibrium in my life wasn't just about financial boundaries or emotional independence. It was about discovering that I was worthy of respect and genuine care, and that demanding those things didn't make me selfish or unloving. It was about learning that the most powerful gift I could give my daughter wasn't unlimited financial support, but the opportunity to develop her own strength, resourcefulness, and capacity for genuine relationship. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for something entirely different from what we had shared before. Whether Eliza would build on that foundation or abandon the effort when the going got difficult would determine the future of our relationship. But for the first time, that outcome felt like it was in her hands rather than mine. 2 years after, that fateful Tuesday morning when Eliza drove away from the airport, I received a phone call that would reframe everything I thought I understood about the lessons I had taught my daughter. It was a call I never could have anticipated, and it revealed the deeper purpose behind what had initially seemed like the most painful betrayal of my life. The call came from Dr. Patterson's office on a Thursday afternoon in early October. My routine follow-up appointment had been scheduled for the following week, but his nurse was calling to ask if I could come in sooner for some additional tests. The tone in her voice immediately transported me back to that first conversation 2 years earlier when my medical journey had begun. "Mrs. Ross," she said carefully, "Dr. Patterson has been reviewing your recent lab work, and there are some changes he'd like to investigate further. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" The familiar flutter of medical anxiety returned, but this time it was accompanied by something I hadn't experienced during my previous health scare: confidence in my ability to handle whatever was coming. The woman who had faced her first medical crisis alone and abandoned had been transformed by that experience into someone who knew she could navigate difficult situations independently. When I arrived for the appointment Friday morning, Dr. Patterson's expression was serious, but not ominous. He explained that the chronic condition we had been monitoring was showing signs of progression that would require more aggressive treatment and potentially significant lifestyle modifications. "Mrs. Ross," he said gently, "the changes we're seeing suggest that the next few years are going to be more challenging from a health perspective. You're going to need a strong support system and potentially some assistance with daily activities as the treatment progresses." The conversation was eerily similar to the one we had had 2 years earlier. When he had asked about my support system, and I had given him that painful answer about having a daughter who was very busy with her own life. But this time, my response was entirely different. Dr. Patterson, I have a much stronger support network now than I did when we first met. I have close friends who have already offered to help with transportation and daily tasks. I have a daughter who has learned to prioritize family relationships. And most importantly, I've learned that I'm much more capable of advocating for myself and managing challenges than I ever realized. As I left the medical center that afternoon, I found myself thinking not about the health challenges ahead, but about the profound transformation that had taken place in my life since that airport abandonment. The crisis that had seemed so devastating at the time had actually been the catalyst for changes that would prove essential for navigating what lay ahead. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport would never have been able to handle a serious health decline with grace and strength. She had been too dependent on others for emotional validation, too willing to sacrifice her own needs for others' convenience, and too focused on maintaining relationships at any cost to develop the inner resources necessary for facing genuine adversity. But the woman I had become through that painful experience was equipped with something far more valuable than unlimited financial resources or enabling relationships. She had self-respect, clear boundaries, and the knowledge that she could survive and thrive even when the people she loved disappointed her. Over the weekend, I made the phone calls I needed to make to inform my support network about the medical developments. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Eden offered to be my primary emergency contact and transportation coordinator. The women from my book club created a schedule for meal preparation and household assistance. Even some of the seniors I had been helping at the community center insisted on reciprocating by offering whatever support they could provide. But the most significant call was to Eliza. When I explained the medical situation, her response demonstrated how much she had truly changed over the past 2 years. "Mom," she said immediately, "what do you need from me? Do you want me to come with you to the next appointment? Should I research treatment options? How can I best support you through this?" The questions were exactly what I would have hoped to hear from a daughter facing her mother's health crisis, focused on my needs rather than her convenience, offering concrete assistance rather than empty sympathy, and demonstrating genuine care rather than obligatory concern. "I would love to have you come to my next appointment," I said. And I realized that for the first time in decades, I was asking for Eliza's help because I wanted her presence rather than because I had no other options. The appointment the following week was a revelation in itself. Eliza arrived early, had prepared thoughtful questions about my treatment options, and took detailed notes during the consultation. When Dr. Patterson explained the potential side effects of the new medications, she asked about strategies for managing them. When he discussed the importance of maintaining social connections during treatment, she volunteered to help coordinate activities with my friends. Most importantly, she was present in a way that had nothing to do with financial transactions or personal benefit. She was there because she loved me and wanted to ensure I received the best possible care, not because she needed something from me or because helping me might advance her own interests. As we sat in the medical center parking lot after the appointment, Eliza turned to me with tears in her eyes. "Mom," she said, "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't cut off the financial support 2 years ago. If you hadn't forced me to grow up and learn to be independent." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I thought I knew where she was going. "I would still be the selfish, entitled person who abandoned you at an airport because helping you was inconvenient. And now, when you really need support and care, I would be completely useless to you. I wouldn't know how to be there for someone else because I never learned that relationships require giving as well as receiving." The insight was profound and accurate. The Eliza who had driven away from the airport 2 years earlier would indeed have been incapable of providing genuine support during a serious health crisis. She had never developed the emotional skills necessary for caregiving because she had never been required to consider anyone's needs but her own. But because you forced me to face consequences and learn to be independent," she continued, "I've had to develop empathy and resourcefulness and genuine care for other people. I've learned to solve problems without relying on your money and, more importantly, I've learned to think about other people's feelings and needs." The transformation in Eliza had been gradual but comprehensive. The financial consequences had forced her to develop practical life skills, but the emotional consequences had forced her to develop character traits that money couldn't buy. She had learned to be grateful rather than entitled, considerate rather than selfish, and genuinely loving rather than transactionally affectionate. "Mom, I realize now that the airport abandonment was actually a gift, even though it didn't feel like one at the time. It was the wake-up call I needed to become someone worthy of being your daughter. As I faced the health challenges ahead, I understood that the painful lessons of 2 years earlier had prepared both of us for this moment. I had learned that I was strong enough to handle adversity independently, which meant I could accept help when it was offered without desperation or manipulation. Eliza had learned to provide genuine support and care, which meant she could be present for me without resentment or obligation. The woman who had been abandoned at an airport had taught her daughter the most important lesson of all: that love without respect is meaningless, that support without boundaries is harmful, and that the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to become their best self. The medical journey ahead would be challenging, but I would be facing it with a daughter who had learned to love authentically, friends who valued genuine reciprocity, and most importantly, a sense of self-worth that didn't depend on anyone else's approval or gratitude. The abandonment that had seemed like the end of our relationship had actually been its beginning. The financial consequences that had appeared vindictive had actually been educational. The painful boundaries that had felt cruel had actually been loving. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals are exactly the catalysts we need to discover our own strength. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who force us to grow the most, and sometimes being abandoned by someone who takes you for granted is the first step toward building relationships with people who truly value your presence. The greatest lesson I learned wasn't about setting boundaries or managing money, or even about family relationships. It was about understanding that my worth as a person wasn't determined by what I could provide to others, but by who I was when I had the courage to demand the respect and care that every human being deserves. The woman sitting in that parking lot, preparing to face a serious health challenge with the genuine support of people who truly cared about her, was someone I never could have imagined becoming when I stood alone in that airport terminal 2 years earlier. But she was exactly who I needed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.